The International Monetary Fund just released its biggest ever SDR allocation. What is SDR? Special drawing rights? Is it a kind of money? Is the global liquidity crisis solved? We're going to talk about it with Jeff Snider, the head of global research, next. But first, ladies and gentlemen, this episode is sponsored by the Zimbabwean Office Depot print shop found on the corner in Springfield in Maine. In business since February 2007, the Zimbabwean Office Depot print shop can take care of all your needs: flyers, postcards, stickers, business cards, and more. All projects are guaranteed to be done within 24 hours. Custom flyers, business flyers, club flyers, folded postcards, wedding invitations, stickers. No matter how large you order, their specially designed presses can handle it. Each printing press is powered by a Soviet-era MiG-29 jet engine, allowing the Zimbabwean Office Depot print shop to deliver any job, anytime. Minimum size order is 1 trillion prints. We now go live to Jeff Snider, deep in the shadows, but he's got a torch. We're going to talk about special drawing rights because the IMF just released their biggest ever allocation of money. Woo!
They must have used the Zimbabwean print shop, right? I mean, that's what it sounds like. They printed something, right? They're kind of making it sound like liquidity, huge, big. Zimbabwe, those two things come together.
Sophistry dressed as reallocation. There's your hint, ladies and gentlemen. Sophistry. It was posted at Alhambra Partners website, the blog, on August 3rd, 2021. Jeff, I love that word, sophistry. What does it mean?
Simply means nothing.
Pretend.
You're using a bunch of words to...
Fancy words.
Yeah, fancy words that make it sound like you're saying something substantial, but they're ultimately they're meaningless.
That's how I got to where I am, Jeff. I feel like maybe you're... Okay, well, moving on to your actual article here. This is from the IMF's July 30th, 2021 statement, gleefully announcing its governing bodies has agreed to the general allocation of 650 billion in
Zimbabwe.
SDRs, biggest in history according to existing quotas. The purpose to boost liquidity. What is the IMF? Why did they do it in 1969? What are special drawing rights? And then we'll get into what it means today.
As we talked about in our earlier segment of this episode, when we talked about the pre-August 1971 breakdown of Bretton Woods, the IMF obviously knew that there was this problem brewing in the international currency system. And it wasn't something that, the idea of a supranational currency wasn't new by 69. I mean, John Maynard Keynes had raised the issue, and he wasn't the first either, but he had actually raised the issue at Bretton Woods in 44 with his idea for what he called Bancor, which was an international currency. So as the Bretton Woods system had broken down from the 50s and 60s, long before August 1971, the IMF, which was actually created in a very different role at Bretton Woods in 44, obviously said, well, maybe we should try this Bancor stuff. Maybe we can create a supranational currency that isn't tied to any national monetary policy or its reserves, the Triffin's paradox of the time. So let's come up with our own international currency. We'll call them special drawing rights, and to keep all of the political animals happy that are involved in IMF, we'll apportion them out by quota. And quota is based upon your membership percentage, or you want to call it shareholder percentage, whatever. You get more SDRs, more money, more international money, the greater the shareholder you are.
Now, earlier I said, I don't remember when, but I said that in 1969 they created and allocated them, but they created them in 1969 and allocated them 1970 and 1972. Today's allocation, get this, so there's a total of 661 billion of these SDRs floating out there. This one that they just did on August 2nd that they approved and is going to be dispersed by the end of this month, 456. I'm not going to do the math. I'm just going to call it 2/3 of all existing SDRs we're just creating. That sounds like a lot of money.
Zimbabwe.
to address the long-term global need for reserves. Just
Emil, I'm starting to get this funny feeling, though. We're
Yes.
talking about hyperinflationary Zimbabwe, but, it's starting to sound a lot like the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing and bank reserves. Are we printing money here? What are we doing here?
That was what I was going to ask you. Is that the direction we were going? And they offer a nice little description. They say it's not a currency; it's a unit of account. So, Jeff, they're just kind of creating it out of thin air? Is that right, or did the United States have to give $400 billion to the SDR?
No, it's simply a ledger entry.
That's so important. So they're making money out of thin air, like the Federal Reserve does, like commercial banks do. And now the question is, this out of thin air money going to make its way into the global economy? Jeff, one last little tangent here. There are 5 currencies in the basket: the dollar, the euro, the yuan, the yen, and sterling. I don't know if we mentioned that. The SDR is not a currency. It's kind of reference to 5 different currencies. And this is important, at the end of 2015, they included the Chinese renminbi. And Jeff, it was purely political, and even according to their own standards, they didn't meet it. What are the standards? Currencies included in the SDR basket have to meet 2 criteria. The export criterion, that you're like one of the top 5 exporters in the world, okay, China, and that it's freely usable money, widely used to make payments for international transactions, and widely traded in principal exchange markets. That's not the Chinese RMB. Okay, Jeff, you don't have to say anything about that. I just wanted to raise that point.
No, it's an important point. Yes.
Oh, yeah?
I think your larger point is that, getting into the sophistry here, it's not money, it's not economics, small e economics we're talking about, as you're talking about quite relevantly, politics. Yuan was included not because it meets the monetary standards of forget the IMF, it meets any monetary standards of any useful, reasonable definitions anywhere. But that's really, the IMF is not a bank. The IMF is not making loans or making currency based on the economic considerations of its customers. It's acting in a political manner because it is a political institution. It only gets a little more complicated because it's an international political institution, and so it has sometimes competing national interests that it has to try to balance. But we don't care about that. We do. Let's be sure. We do care about that. But for our purposes here, we're strictly analyzing the monetary and the monetary capacity, and therefore the economic possibilities of what should be or should not be a useful currency. And that's really the issue here. They can create all the press releases and statements they want. And I think they used the Zimbabwean Office Depot for this too, because the press release was everywhere. And it said, liquidity. We just created a bunch of money. Everybody go home. It's crisis over. Everything's fine. And already you're sort of thinking, well, wait a minute. What crisis? Wasn't the crisis over last year? Why are we still doing crisis stuff this year? Because I heard Jay Powell. He was on 60 Minutes last year, and he said he flooded the world with digital dollars. So why are we flooding the world with these new SDRs? Already the question should be working through your mind and asking, right away, what is going on here? What are they really attempting to do? Why are they tying SDRs to this nebulous term liquidity? What is really the purpose?
The IMF has flooded the world with SDRs 5 times. Now listen to these dates: 1970, 1972, 1979, 1981. Not great economic times. And then, Jeff, 2009.
Before we get to the 2000, those 4 earlier ones, remember what their purpose was?
No,
because at the time, during the great inflation, it wasn't that we had a shortage of euro dollars, we had too many. And so the SDR was meant sort of in a half-hearted way to maybe possibly become a competing stable currency, restricted, something more like Bretton Woods had been, because there was way, way too many euro dollars at that time, because it had that early days of the system had gone insane and created all sorts of new forms of money that nobody could check anywhere. And so the SDR and those earlier allocations were meant to be not so much for liquidity, but for stability. And so the IMF was acting politically in reaction to the overriding conditions of that era, which were too much euro dollars. Now, as you're going to say next, they're fast forward to 2009, their next allocation was the opposite, right?
It was the opposite, but it was also gigantic, Jeff.
Because
so
now we're not talking about stability, we're now talking about liquidity, because there's a shortage of dollars.
Just to give people a sense, the 1972-1981 allocations, 9.3 billion SDRs and 12.1 billion SDRs, respectively. Then the special allocation in 2009 was the combined total, 21.5. And then the general allocation in 2009, 161.2 billion SDRs, a flood of money. And Jeff, that's kind of the key point of your article.
That's the end of the story, right? That's where our story ends. That flood of money at the end, at the tail end of the global financial crisis, obviously solved all problems, and we've never had a monetary problem since. I mean, that was the message that we got in 2009 when they did the allocation. They said, "Look, we just had a global breakdown. It's a monetary breakdown. Subprime mortgages, blah blah blah. Here is the equivalent of $250 billion in US dollars worth of SDRs being created. We're going to make sure we allocate them to the smallest, poorest countries on the earth so that they have sufficient liquidity that something like this could never possibly happen again." This gigantic, and again, it should sound a lot like quantitative easing and bank reserves, because you get the same message in both areas. They're saying, yes, we just had a liquidity crisis. We've just solved it by printing money. Except in the one form, QE, they print bank reserves, and in the other, the IMF SDRs, is it actually useful money, or are we just being sophists? Are we just talking politics and hoping people don't ask any more questions and stop looking into these kinds of affairs? And that's really, go ahead, Emil.
You briefly, speaking of politics, you briefly raised the point of the big spending, the ARA in 2009, how that also, fiscal, right? So the fiscal United States spending, that didn't make a difference, just like presumably our current Biden-led administration, and that fiscal spending is not going to make a difference, like this SDR allocation isn't going to make a difference like it didn't in 2009. Jeff, you do raise China in this story and something in 2016. Is there anything that you wanted to bring in with the world's second largest economy and their relationship with SDRs?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you believe that the IMF, and this is liquidity, and that SDR allocation in 2009 was a huge addition to the global money supply, whatever the hell that is, then you would think that the era beyond 2009, the next couple of years, extending well into the future, would have been completely, utterly free of monetary type events, right? There's sufficient money supply in SDRs or bank reserves or anything else. Yet the history of that era is exact opposite. In fact, we've had one constant dollar problem after another, and I don't hear the letters SDR in any of these things. Nobody is appealing to SDRs to plug their eurodollar holes. What are they doing? Like the Japanese in 1963, they're selling treasuries because they have a eurodollar problem. SDRs don't appear to be very useful. And that really kind of came to a head in a very big way with the Chinese, especially beginning in 2012, 2013, 2014, moving forward into 2015 and 2016, where, yes, the yuan is now convertible, but that doesn't change the fact that they actually have the world's biggest dollar problem, because there is a dollar problem, and it doesn't make a bit of difference that there was this massive SDR allocation in 2009, because SDRs are not useful money.
Jeff, any other final concluding thoughts? Otherwise, we'll move on to part 3.
The concluding thoughts is they make a big deal out of the big numbers. They make a big deal out of saying this is going to help those that are hardest hit, and in doing so, again, as I said, this should raise in your mind, I've heard this before. I heard this with quantitative easing and bank reserves. And these two things sound the same because they essentially are the same. It's sophistry disguised as something else. It's actually sophistry disguising what these things really are, and then what they really are, or what they really are not, is effective and useful money.
In part 3, we're going to discuss some bad news for my fellow American citizens regarding their income. It turns out that you did not earn as much money as you thought you did. We're going to talk about it next.